made my ex really mad. He was like, "You're too old for that. You're not going to grow up and be a wuss or a sissy." And he told him to go back in there, and that if he cried or came out of the room, that he would beat him. And then he told me that if I went to him, that he would beat them. If I went to them and like tried to do any of those things anymore, and he found out, he would beat all of them. And that, I think, was one of the major points of my life that kind of broke me in the way that was like, if I have to die trying to figure out a way out of this, then that's what's going to happen.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Crime and Entertainment. Please welcome this very special guest, Jessie Randall. Jessica, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
So we actually met on Facebook.
Yes.
And there was a post that you put out about surviving being in a church cult. And I've done a lot of shows with a lot of different people from a lot of walks of life. And I'll be honest with you, that really piqued my interest. And our first phone conversation, I believe, went in excess of an hour. And you broke down a lot of the story, and it's something that I've never heard of, that I've never covered. I've heard of them, but nothing local. Right. You know, you're actually local to the area here, and it was very interesting. So I asked you if you would do the show, and you graciously came to Charleston to film in person. So thank you for that.
No problem.
And we're going to get into your story. So tell us. We'll just start from the beginning. Where did you grow up? What area?
I was born in Camden, and I grew up in Lexington and Cassett.
Okay. Now, when you were growing up, how early were you exposed to this church cult situation?
So my parents started going when I was like 2. So from my earliest memories.
Yeah, so you were born into this almost. So what was, as a kid, what was it like? Like I remember as a kid going to church, and at least to my knowledge, it was fairly normal. As a kid, for you, when did you start realizing that something isn't quite right about this?
I think I must have been weird as a child in some ways, just because I never felt like it was normal. And I've talked to a lot of different people, and that's not something that is the norm, because usually you just kind of accept your reality as a kid. And so I think that's the one way that I'm different than a lot of the other kids that I grew up with. But it was very I would say traumatizing, like even as a kid. Like I didn't enjoy it. I was there was a lot of like things that were controlling and painful and restrictive, so it was very difficult to kind of accept what was happening a lot of the time.
Well, and I have that conversation with a lot of people. As a kid, you don't know if something's not typical or right. You a lot of times you don't even know your family status. Like you don't know if you're middle class, upper class, poor. You're just a kid. So if you knew something wasn't right, like at an early age, then the story's going to get really interesting here going forward. So when you say not right, how was you being able to tell? Was this like conversations you would have with other kids?
No, I was really, it was all related to how it made me feel.
Okay.
And I think one of my first memories was so we were in the sanctuary, would have been the sanctuary of the church, and there were 2 teenage boys babysitting all of the kids. That were there for, what is it called? Like Bible college. They had started their own Bible college. So they had it on one side where the kitchen was, and like children's church usually was. They had all the adults, and they were doing their classes, and they had all the kids in sanctuary area. And I remember the teenage boys saying, you can get under that table and play with dolls like a girl does. Like, that's what the girls do. And the boys are going to play this game, like, they were crawling under the benches and stuff. And I told them I didn't want to do either of those things. I wanted to go where my dad was, which was and they said, you can't do that. And I said, yes, I can. And they said, no. And I was like, okay, well, basically my choice was this or that. So I chose under the table, and I waited for them to go play the game they were playing with the other kids. And as soon as they walked away, I ran to the door where everyone else, my parents were at, and I went in there anyway. So I ran through, which caused a scene in the Bible college area, and they were not happy.
Yeah.
And I remember adults grabbing me, and someone picked me up and was saying, oh, this one's wild or rebellious. You need to beat that out of her. And I remember my dad taking me from that person, and I'm like, nah, it'll be okay. And they let me sit with him, but I remember the boys chasing me in there, and they were, I guess, kind of in trouble because they'd let me escape. But it was kind of the idea of I was always being put in some sort of restricted area or box and told you can't do this or that. And so whatever was my natural feeling towards well, why can't I be where I feel safe, which was with my parents at that time. I didn't understand why I couldn't be, because that had never happened before. I don't have any memories before that of being told, well, you can't. So that part kind of just, I guess for the rest of my life, it was that same sort of, well, you have to be this, you have to do this. And it was always in my head. It didn't align with who I was. It didn't align with what I believed to be true or felt to be right, because it wasn't my idea, I guess. I don't know. I don't really have an explanation for why. I didn't feel like they knew what they were talking about, but
what you mentioned too on our phone conversation that they really try to keep you excluded from everywhere else, like any sort of social media or any sort of, or probably not social media back then, but TV shows, radio, even outside contact with other people your age. Is that so they can kind of train your mind that these sorts of situations are normal?
So that's probably the biggest aspect of how it works is isolation. And it's the most important, I think, thing to understand is it's self-imposed isolation for any adult in it. It's not, so they instruct you, no movies, no places of the world. You're not going to go to events that would seem worldly, to go with the flow, no concerts, no movies, no participation with festivals or, that kind of thing that would be just what other people would commonly do for fun.
I'd be kicked out of that so fast. It's not really fun.
So none of that. You couldn't even really, you were supposed to cut off any family members that didn't align. And they wouldn't say cut off. They would say, you're called to come out of the world and be separate. Sorry. You'll be separated and be separated for God, apart from the world. You're supposed to be a light, and you can't be a light if you're a part of the world, and that includes your family if their ideas or their belief systems are different, or they're living what would be quote unquote sinful lifestyles. So if they drank, they smoked, they were gay, they had, whatever their list of rules, standards were, they didn't dress the same, they went to places like the beach and participated in activities there like everybody else. You weren't to be, being seen with them would be you agreeing with them. So, and any worldly ideas, which means media related, you weren't to listen to, because that's basically the devil trying to convince you to become a part of what would be your downfall. Basically, you're going to be a part of the world. You might, what they call, fall into sin, know, and then the devil will get your mind and he'll steal your family, and they
try to scare you into the falling in line.
Right. And there were always a list of very long list of standards to be considered godly. Like, you can be saved, but that's different than being one of the, I guess, more elite in the church. So there was a standard difference. There was the people who would come from all different walks of life, and if they, said they got saved, their standard of living coming from the world, they would have to adjust to what the church's standard of living was, which is the standards for righteousness, which would be, you got to cut your hair, you can't have long hair, if you're a man, you have to wear clothes that make you look very, I guess, professional, or not feminine in any way. Like certain colors like pink and purples were like, for the longest time, guys, even when we left, like, the men who preached shouldn't wear pink ties in the pulpit, because that would offend other men who felt that that was effeminate, and you wouldn't want to offend other brothers. So just, there was a lot of things you couldn't do. No drinking, no smoking, no chewing tobacco. Obviously no, like, for women, back in the earlier days, makeup and, pantyhose and stuff was an issue, because, pantyhose were like pants, and those were men's garments. The church actually had to split over those kind of standards in the beginning, because there were men who believed that their wives shouldn't cut their hair, period. They shouldn't be allowed to wear anything that drew attention to themselves, jewelry, makeup. They weren't allowed to wear pantyhose, because you put them on like you put on pants. And when we left, there were still camps that our kids were like supposed to go to, where the girls couldn't wear leggings under their skirts, even though skirts were mandatory for them to be allowed to go for activities, because those were pants and those were men's garments.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like cross-dressing. So
restrict.
Yeah, a little bit. So, and in the women's side of things, like, you're supposed to wear dresses, skirts, or modest clothing. You can't wear anything tight or short. You have to have like mid-calf. Like, can't be like up to your knee, because when you're walking, you're like stepping, someone might see your knee. And if you see your knee, then that's, you're causing mental lust. And there's a lot of ways you can cause mental lust, but from a very young age, that was kind of the indoctrination. Like, you were raised to be a wife, a mother, nothing else. And also the children, the men in charge, the pastors, the preachers, they were instructing all the people to homeschool, so that your kids are not given any outside influence whatsoever, because that will destroy them as people. And I was told that for my own kids, but also before homeschooling was legal, and that was in the early 90s, we were pulled from I hadn't yet gone to school. My oldest brother was in a Christian school in kindergarten, and he got to finish school, but after he got out, we were all pulled out and we went to homeschool. And so the focus was to basically, all the way around, the whole complete cycle of your life was revolved around church and religion. There was no outside influence of what other people were doing. So your whole entire life was a bubble. And for men, or the boys, you were raised to be, the leader of the home, and potentially a pastor, preacher, and the girls were wives and mothers. Like, there wasn't any other idea introduced. Like, you can be XY, like, you can go out and have a career of any kind as a female. You're supposed to be at home making babies, taking care of babies.
It essentially sounds like they're trying to brainwash, at least, if not the women, everybody in that whole circle, which is why they don't want you talking to anybody else outside of the circle or seeing anything that's letting you know that there's a lot more that women can do in the business world. I mean, women have crazy places in business and all kind of stuff all around the world. I mean, they're just as powerful as men nowadays. And it sounds like if they're wanting to, and this is mid-90s too, so they're trying to definitely keep you down. And I think one thing that jumps off the board with me with this, though, I got to go to mom and dad. Like, are they both sold all in with this? Because if they're not, then typically they don't force the kids to be with it. It sounds like they're in. Where are they sitting with this?
So, strangely enough, in that culture, it's usually the men. And that's not the strange part, because men would gravitate towards that religion for that reason. It gave them all the power and nobody else to answer to.
Right.
Other than God, and for whatever reason, my dad is not a very dominating type of personality. He's a very chill person. Mm-hmm. He was never 100% sold on it. He went along with it because it's what my mom wanted to do, but she was like die hard into this. Like,
had she been into it since a kid?
No, that's the strange part. She came into it when we went. My uncle was actually the first of her family to go, and he was like, and I guess they really hadn't been raised around a whole lot of religious type of thing. I don't know what their religious background wasn't very intense. They went to church occasionally as a kid like everybody else, and it wasn't anything serious. But for whatever reason, my uncle was convinced that this was like, something he needed to make sure that she didn't miss out on. And she came and they thought it was, the answer. They thought these people had the answers. And she was very much sold out completely on the ideology. So she followed to the letter what she was told, and it's she's a very literal person. Mm-hmm. So everything that was said, she would do. So whenever, the instructions then, and it was early 90s, so there were no like restrictions, and there was no censoring of, the instruction from the people in charge, or the pastors and associates and things like that, were to make sure your kids turn out well. They would take the verses from the Bible that talked about if you beat your son many times, you'll save his soul from hell. And it's a verse in Proverbs that's, something they just go back to repetitively. But so the indoctrination part, and the reason that the cycles continue, is because people who come in are coming from a powerless position in life, and they feel like they don't have the answers, and they're in a place where they need somebody to basically be a father figure to them. Mm-hmm. They need that influence in their life, so they look at this person like they have all the answers, and so they just do what they're told. And the men gain a lot of respect and community and adoration through that process, whereas women, it's kind of, you become more and more enslaved, and of course kids. But for her, she took everything to heart, and when they said, our routine was learn these Bible verses, like put it in their heart, and when they're old they won't depart from it, like you're gonna consume this religiously. And like we had to learn chapters of the Bible, and then there was discipline. Everything was wrong. Mm. You didn't move right, and you were going to get beat. And there wasn't really, as a kid, my experience of it was like, you hear the rules, and me as a person in my entire life, I've always been like, you tell me what I need to do or not do. There's no problem. Like, I'm not someone who's trying to go against for that reason, just to do it. I'm not that type of person. But if I do see an inconsistency or a reason why this is not a good idea, or I see that it's harming people more than it's helping, then I have questions, then I have concerns, and I have pushback. But as a kid, adults are the authority. You don't get to push back.
Mm-hmm.
So the more pushback you have as a kid, the more you get beat. And also, if you have weird questions at a young age, you're devil possessed, is what I found out.
Jeez.
I had a lot of questions, and that I think concerned adults in that religious community. Like, how do we know that this God is the true God? If, because they would teach about other religions and how they were wrong, like Roman Catholicism, Jehovah's Witnesses, like they would go down the list and say, oh, all of them are wrong and we're right. And I, as a kid, would think, well, if they're convinced they're right and we're convinced we're right, how does anyone know what's right?
Right.
And that was not something that you were allowed to do. So that got me in trouble a lot. So they make perfect soldiers out of kids with the routine of, it's like the cycle of indoctrination and abuse, like on repeat. And it's like, in order for you not to get harmed or hurt, you eventually learn, don't question. You don't question, and you just do what everyone else does, follow the pattern, and you'll be okay. Or maybe not okay, but you won't suffer as much. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I think most kids just did without question, because you don't have any other reality to reference, so you don't think, well, this isn't right. You just follow.
Mm-hmm. I gotta ask, like, what's the severity of these beatings? Because I go back in the early 90s, like my grandmother's was old school. You went out and picked a switch, she whipped your ass with, and that's how she operated. But like, is this like to the point of like child abuse when you guys ask questions like this?
So it wouldn't be just questions, but sometimes it wouldn't even be like, you wouldn't know the rules. And I think that was probably the worst part for me. I don't know. I know like my siblings and other kids as well. It's just like they would determine your attitude, or they might think you're possessed by a devil. So then you get beat. But they were not, I would say, normal spankings. You'd have to go pick a stick, and if it wasn't big enough or sturdy enough, you'd have to go back out. And if they broke it on you, which they tried to, you had to go get another one and start over again. Or if you moved. And the problem with that was, like, the way that you got beat, there's no way not to move, because it was like, I knew kids that got beat from their neck down their back. I can remember my brothers getting beat to, like, I was talking to my daughter yesterday, and the one thing that I'll never be able to forget is the screams of my siblings getting beat as a kid. That's like something that will live in my mind forever. And I can remember one time my brother and the boys would have to pull down their pants, and because their jeans were thicker, and he'd gotten repetitively, because he kept moving, and like you couldn't put your hands behind you, and he ran from my mom, and I remember him tripping over his pants, and he had blood on him, and he was just screaming, and he had to go back and get, like, more, and you would be bruised. You would have bruises. You would have, the boys very frequently would have blood, and especially the older they got, and the more they might get into trouble. But I remember for me, like, the not moving thing was really hard. So you had to, like, just be there until you got a certain amount of licks, and it just depended on, what you did and what they had decided. But I remember getting spanked, or, and her saying, we're going to be here till you stop moving. And realizing that there was nothing I could do, because there was no way to control your body. It just starts doing what it wants at a certain point. You're twitching, you're moving involuntarily, and realizing I could go to a place in my head, kind of like zone out, and that kept me still enough for it to stop. But I can remember when I was finished that time, like being completely soaked with sweat from just like the nonstop, and just being, and like not having the energy to even cry anymore. You know, just being like at a point where your just body is like, you know, I don't know other word than traumatized. But that was the norm, and it was seen as like there were guys who were proud of their skills in that, like their kids. And my ex-husband, his dad was one that it was like legendary with all the kids. You did not want to get spanked by him. And another part of this, which is crazy to me now as an adult looking at it, all of the adults, all of the grown male adults were allowed to spank you at any point in time at church, and you did. You got
no matter
spanked.
whose kids they were.
Right. It didn't matter. And in junior church, which is where all of the kids would go while the adults were in their services, they were all, there was a switch on the chalkboard, not a switch, but a stick. And while in class, there was not a single time that we were ever in junior church that someone didn't get pulled up to the front and spanked in front of everybody and sent back. That was a completely normal part of our lives. And it's not until now, you know, like looking back at it, that you're like, how is this happening? These are complete, you know, like.
But you guys were almost desensitized to it at that point because it was every day.
It was so normal.
Everyday occurrence.
It was like, you know, everyone, this is what everyone does. But you, of course, didn't want to be the one that was, because it was not just abuse, it was humiliation.
Yeah. And
that, I think, is probably the level of abuse. I don't think it's without going into all of the traumatizing things for people to understand how, on a daily basis, like this is day to day, week to week, year to year, and then this produces psychopaths, and it's the perfect recipe to produce religious psychopaths, because all they've ever known is this. They've only known pain, religious viewpoints, humiliation, so their whole entire personality is built on humiliation, abuse, and religion. And they become people who are obsessed with control because they never had any, and power because as a kid growing up, you don't have power. That's the other thing that I think is hard for a lot of people to understand, is knowing what it's like to go from having no choices at all. You don't choose the clothes you wear, literally the food you eat, nothing. Like, you don't have any control of your life as a child. You're told what you're doing from the time you wake up to the time you go to sleep. And to go from that to being an adult and having to make choices, and all you have behind you is this indoctrination and these viewpoints. What I saw happen for most of the kids that I grew up with, the men were very, very broken, especially because I think females, from what I saw, we tend to be more like, try to figure out what happened and why we felt how we felt. The males never questioned. For the most part, they didn't question. They just became what they saw, and they had to do it so well because everything was about performance. That was their sole focus. And those kids becoming adults were much worse, I think, in a lot of ways than even their parents were in that religious aspect, because it's not even to them, like, their parents were coming from a different background. They were coming from what they considered the world's viewpoints to God. And when you're raised in that bubble, that's all, that your experience is. And so those children growing up and becoming, they either left completely, a lot of them were criminals. A lot of them are just, there was so much bad that the people didn't become healthy, whole people. Some of them became functioning adults, but with a lot of baggage that I don't know if will ever fully be worked out.
Mm-hmm.
So it's.
Well, I mean, I don't see how you couldn't come out of that with some tough baggage to carry on. And just out of curiosity, you were talking about the weapons that you and your brother would gotten. Those are coming from your mother mostly?
Mostly, yes. My dad would. So if you got 3 spankings in a day from your mom, you would get beat by your dad when he came home. And most kids did get 3 in a day, because if you didn't say yes ma'am or no ma'am for one thing, or there was a million ways to end up in that position. So, or if you walked into a room and they thought you looked devil possessed, it wasn't really like a preventable.
I mean, like I hear things sprinkled in that I've heard in like the regular churches. Like I have heard that phrase you talked about earlier, like, you know, if you instill it in them now, they'll come back to it when they're older. Mm-hmm. I've heard that. And there's, you know, you want them to say yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am. But then when you walk into a room, I mean, it might be tired. You think they're possessed by the devil. I mean, it seems like it takes some of the values that's more common throughout the different denominations, but then it just, you know, layers it on with all this really heavy craziness that you got going on that you had to go through here.
So I don't know. I guess coming from it, you don't really know what the norm
right
is.
And that's the thing. When you're in it from 2 years old, you got no idea, especially when they cut you off from the outside world. And
I think that part, I was never a fan of, I mean, I don't think any kid is a fan of that, but I think even as a kid, I didn't want to be a part of what it was. Right. So I ended up being a problem often because I didn't like having to wear dresses all the time. I didn't like to wear the shoes they made, you know, like just being a girl, you know, like I was, when I was little, I was very much a tomboy. I wanted to do what the boys were doing, and you weren't supposed to as a girl. So I was constantly being, you know, pulled back in, like, you're supposed to be X, Y, and Z because you're like going to be a wife and a mother, and I'd be like, I don't want that, you know. And then that was seen as unnatural, and that's a theme that has followed me my entire life with everyone in the religious community that I came from. Anytime that I've ever said that, like, I didn't want to be a wife and a mother, I didn't want to grow up and get married and have kids. I didn't want that. I saw what happened to the mothers. I saw what happened to the children. That wasn't a life I wanted for anybody. And I certainly didn't want to have kids and have them experience. I never would want someone that I gave birth to feel what I felt growing up, because it wasn't worth living. Like, it wasn't worth living that experience. So to me, that seemed like the most insane idea to prioritize or just think that was the end goal for life, to be a wife and a mother. And but that was very much pushed, and in the culture we were in, there was a lot of very dangerous people, the men, the adult males especially. When I was like maybe 4, between 4 and 5, the assistant pastor approached my mother, and he asked, he was like, your daughter's so beautiful. I really, you know, I think she's going to grow up and be a gorgeous, you know, attractive female. I want you to save her for one of my sons. And his boys at the time were teenagers. They were the ones that were watching us, you know, while their parents were doing Bible study. And as a kid, that's a terrifying thought. You're standing next to your mom with this guy asking that, and you're thinking, what? You know, like, that's a terrifying idea. And I expected her to also feel that way, like to think, well, that's a scary idea, you know, like, why would you, you know, say something like that? But she seemed flattered and excited and told him she would. And I remember as a kid, that was like, I think that was the break. You know what, as a kid, when you're growing up and you see your parent as just a human, like you see their, I guess, humanity, their cracks, and you realize they're not God or perfect, or, you know, that was my moment where you're just like, oh, okay, I'm by myself. And that, and he was, you know, he was like, oh, I think it would be perfect. You know, I don't know which one it'll be, but, you know, we'll figure that out later, kind of thing. And I remember her telling my dad on the ride home, and I freaked out. You know, I was just like, I'm not growing up. I'm not getting married. I'm not doing that. And she was like, well, you have to. That's, you know, that's what God wants us to do. That's our calling. And I remember thinking, you know, there's no way. Like, I'm not getting married. I don't want to marry a boy. They're like, you have to marry a boy. That's your only option. I was like, well, I'll marry my dad then. And they're like, no, you can't do that. It's your dad. And then I was like, well, fine, I won't grow up. You know, that was my solution. And I remember them laughing about it, but me spending years being so scared of that reality, because from that point on, he would check in and ask about it. And like, the fear of that, and like being groomed for it, and my mom always being so concerned about my looks and my weight, and she would be like, well, you're getting fat, so you need to, like, nobody's going to want to be your wife. Like, when I was 10, I didn't even know I didn't have a concept of weight. I didn't know what body image, I had no idea. And like, to be told so young by the person that's you see as the one supposed to protect you and love you most, oh, well, you're not going to be good enough because some guy might think you're fat. As a 10-year-old, you're just like, and then she would like try to control what I ate or did, which we hardly had food anyway. We were poor. But, and looking back at it, I was like, I was just, you know, there wasn't even a way for me to be fat at that age. You know, I was just growing. I was just going through a normal cycle, but that was a constant theme with her and me, like, and I had horrible acne because I was so stressed out all the time, I think. And she'd be like, you need to cover that up because no man is going to want to, you know, marry you when you look like that, and that kind of thing. So everything was about what the man wanted, and you didn't have any choices. And like, it wasn't like, oh, I don't want to do this, I don't like this, or I don't want to, you know, participate, I don't want to get married, I don't want to have a man, as that was unheard of, you know, like, there's something wrong with you. And if I don't want to clean house and take care of babies, which is what you do from a very, very young age, like, I was taking care of kids at 6, 7, you know, my siblings. I knew how to clean. I'd do everything except for wash clothes, so we didn't have a washer and dryer at that time. But all of the regular, we were trained to do all of those things. I was going to other people's houses and helping after they had their babies. You weren't allowed to go to anyone's house for anything, like sleepovers and stuff, except for certain church people. And they would, basically, if you were an older girl, you could go and stay and help out because everyone had a ton of kids. You know, that's what they would do. That's also one of the things that they would preach is birth control was abortion. Abortion was wrong. Birth control, any sort of contraception, because you're preventing what God would have made happen. And it's your job to repopulate the earth with godly people, kind of idea. So, which is why they push you to kind of connect and hook up with people inside the church. Right. You're not supposed to go. It's a terrible idea, you know. Like, would they promote you to, like, how is the dating, like, when you get to be a teenager? Like, are they promoting you to date? Because that's kind of like a double-edged sword. You would think like they would want to keep you secluded from everything like that, anything sexuality, but then at the same time, they're kind of pushing you towards people inside the church, and they're telling you your job is to repopulate. That's God's will type of situation. How does that work? not well. I don't understand now, looking back at it, how they expected that to go, but there was zero sexual education. I was never told. I was pregnant before I knew how you made a baby. I did not know. I was never told. No one told me about having a period, like nothing. You were not, that was seen as bad. Like, you can't talk about those things. And it's just something that happens when you get married, and you'll find out one day. And that was always not that we had a lot of questions, because as kids, you don't talk.
Yeah.
That's another part of it. Like, everyone would comment on how good we were as kids. Like, oh, your kids are so well behaved. And you make perfect little soldiers because they're afraid to say anything. You know, like, I'm not going to tell you I'm hungry. I need to pee. I need, like, you don't hear from me.
Yeah, because you got a crack.
Exactly. Yeah. I will suffer, like, whatever the situation is. So you don't go to your parents with questions. You also don't go to your parents if anything is happening to you. And that's another part of the sinister side of this is the level of abuse that kids are going through by their own parents, like, prevents them from having any help from the abuse that they're getting from the predators in the church.
Mm-hmm.
And if someone abuses you sexually or physically outside of your family, there is nowhere to go. Because if you go to your family and say something, one, especially in the 90s, it's getting a little better, I think, these days. Not much, but children were not believed. Like, mm-hmm. You're not going to say something and then they take your word over an adult. The adult is God, basically,
mm-hmm.
And so you're going to go and, you don't go for anything. So yeah, there's no such thing as dating. There's courting, which is a boy kind of like lets the family know his intentions, and he comes over and spends time with the whole family. Mm-hmm. You're never allowed alone. You don't go on dates together by yourself. You aren't supposed to touch at all. At least in my household, they didn't want us touching at all. But it's more like a boy kind of chooses you. Luckily for me, the associate pastor's sons grew up and chose their own people before I was so that was a relief for me. But my ex, whenever he was at a teenage age, started coming over to my house and eventually was like, this is what I want.
So they succeeded in getting you to get involved with someone within the church?
Well, my mom was not happy because I think she never, I don't think, let go of the idea of the original plan from whatever that was. So I think she was still a little upset that didn't happen. She didn't like my ex. My dad did. And, I mean, as a kid too, I didn't want to get married, but, I didn't mind having him as a friend, whatever the case may be with that. You're a teenager. You're stupid. Mm-hmm. You're just like, oh, somebody likes me. But I was very afraid of it, like very afraid of marriage, but there is no non-serious interaction. So everything has to have a huge, if I'm talking to him, I can't talk, to anybody else. Right. It's so from the time he started coming to see me, there was no other options, you couldn't explore anything else because then you're a bad girl. You can't talk to anybody else. Not that there was options for that in the church. There was kids outside of the church that would come to our house, but you're not supposed to talk to them like that. So
I want to expand on one thing you mentioned earlier. You said if there's abuse going on with people within the church, the kids are then scared to go to their own parents to talk about this because they're not believed. And, I guess to talk bad about somebody in that church is, a bad thing in and of itself. Was there a lot of that going on?
Yes, there was a lot. I'm pretty sure at one point there was more predatory people than there wasn't. I know so the original, pastor that I grew up under was my ex's grandfather. So it was just, they were making, the church at that point. It just started, and I think it started in the 80s, sometime during the 80s, maybe late 70s. But it was very young at that point. And there was 2 assistant pastors. The one that I mentioned earlier was one, and he was predatory towards women. He would groom them to sleep with them. And then the other, his oldest son ended up going to prison for sexually assaulting all of his siblings, and there was 8, I believe. And we were not allowed to have sleepovers with anyone in our families or outside, we weren't allowed to do that. It's not safe. Every single child was allowed to have sleepovers at his house in our church. Like everyone, because he was the assistant pastor, it was seen as safe. We would go, and they had a bunch of kids, and they were always like asking for us to come over and spend the night and help. Like that was a big thing back then, is like send your girls over to help at other people's houses with babies, with housework, because there's so many kids. And we would all go. There'd be like a group of, my brothers would go with me. My now ex, his sisters would come with me. We would all sleep over there on a pretty regular basis. And it was everyone, like, of the kids knew it was a weird household, but that was the crazy part about it, is like not a single one of us ever went to our parents and said anything. And you just don't.
Because of his rank in the church, and you're afraid of the blowback. Well,
I think just in general, they would say over the pulpit frequently, like, if your child comes to me and says something negative about so-and-so, or says they don't have to listen to Mr. whatever his name is, and I'll snatch him up myself and beat him, and then you can beat him too. It was like, you don't question the authority of adults. It was absolute. And it was kind of the same thing as questioning God. So in a situation, they were right and you were wrong. Mm-hmm. So whatever they chose to do was right by default, and you were wrong if you had a problem with it. So the question never enters your head of like, oh, should I tell an adult this? Because you think, we're not safe if we tell anybody this. We're going to get hurt. So
they almost have like their little setup of in-house trafficking, so to speak, because nobody's, people are scared to say anything, or the kids are scared to say anything.
They had, it is a perfect place for predators. Perfect place.
Hiding in plain sight with a good cover.
And be seen as an upstanding, safe member of the community. Yeah,
with a good cover. Mm-hmm. It's you unfortunately you see that a lot, because when you're in those situations, it's like if you're part of the church, I can trust him.
Exactly.
Or, they put themselves in positions to be around kids. I think I spoke with you about a guy that I interviewed named Gary Poche, and it's a famous outcome, because he was kidnapped by his karate instructor, and they went like states away. This was in Louisiana, and they went all the way to California, and they tracked him down. The guy let him call home to his mom. They tracked him down, and they found him. Well, when he got back, they was trying to make sure he was good and everything was going. Mm-hmm. When they found out he had been sexually assaulted by the karate instructor. And then upon further investigation, they realized that this has been going on for years, and nobody knew. And so his dad, obviously being furious, waited at a bank of phone booths in New Orleans airport. And when they're getting the guy off the plane, because he's extradited from California to go back to New Orleans to stand trial or get arrested for all this, he's walking through, and the guy turns around at the phone booth and just puts one in his head. And it's a clip out there. You can find it. Usually you see that thing pop up every Father's Day. The guy's got on some big glasses, a big beard, and his name was Gary Poche. And like in the background, you hear the guy saying, Why, Gary? Why? Why, Gary? Why? And that actually caused a rift between the son and the dad. And obviously the son's much older now, but he was like, I was so mad. He was like, nobody knew what was happening to me. He's like, now that my dad done what he did, now everybody knew. But they patched things up, and thank goodness the guy didn't even get any jail time. They gave him like probation for like an ungodly amount of time, but everybody in the town knew him. Everybody in the town loved him. It's alleged that people in high positions tipped him off of when that guy was going to be coming to the airport. So he was there and he was ready and he was waiting on him. But, like I said, they put themselves in positions like that to be trusted. And a church is the perfect cover. So you mentioned your now ex, you met him in the church. How did you meet? And then you two guys eventually got away from it?
So about the time I was, we got engaged when I was 14 because he was coming down since I was like 12.
And real quick, is that promoted like 14? Because that's pretty young to be engaged. Was that promoted within the church?
It's pretty normal.
Really? Jesus Christ.
There was, when I was a kid, there was a 14-year-old that married a 40-something-year-old.
40-year-old man?
Her parents signed for it because he had money.
Holy cow.
She was either 14 or 16. But it was seen as just a normal, if a man said, so here's the thing, the danger that I see in religious communities is God told me, and they're a man of God, and no one can question God. Nobody, you didn't hear from God today, and he didn't tell you to, that it's his will for you to go marry the 16-year-old. So you can't question it. You can't question if someone else says it as, just another person, because you don't know what God told someone else. And that is used to do horrible things inside of those communities, because men, that's a routine day for me was, well, this is what God's will is for me as a man in this relationship. This is what God called me to do. This is what God said, put on my heart. This is what he wants. I'm the leader. You have to do it without question. Those are the norms. Those are the control tactics. At that point, there is no other. There is nothing. There's no higher power for you to call on to save yourself. That's it. So anything can be done. And you can use his name to do it. And if you're a man, that means you can do anything. If you're a woman, it doesn't work that way, because you're not a woman of God. It's only a man of God, because it's another part of it. Women cannot be leaders inside of there. You do not have the option. You don't have the authority by God or anyone else in this world, because it doesn't matter what the world says. Women are to be submissive, subjective, and a servant to a man, to make his life better and to serve him and her children. And that's your only position.
So it seems like if you're trying to get out of situations like that, for men in power in the church, being able to use those situations to take advantage of young females or children, I'm sure this probably could have been happening to male and female, you would get attached to someone at an early age. Would that seclude you from that happening to you if you were engaged to someone? Would that, in a sense, protect you?
So for me, the only way out was going to be a man.
Okay.
You don't have choices. My parents wouldn't allow me to go to school. I wanted to go to school. They wouldn't allow me to go. I was obsessed with art. I wanted to be, an artist, a writer, all of those things. But there was no outlet for that. I wasn't allowed to go into anything that would allow me opportunities. So I wasn't allowed to have a job. They would tell me, your husband will decide. And if you can drive a car, if you can have a job, that'll be up to him. So I ran away multiple times. And they kept bringing me back. At between 15 and 16, I ran away three times. The fourth time I got away. But I knew that the only way out was going to be running away with the guy, because that's like, someone had to take me that wasn't tied down. Like, I don't have a car. I can't drive a car. I don't have a license because I'm not allowed to do that. I don't have a job. I have no money. I can't get a job because I don't have any personal identification or access to it. Like, I don't have a birth certificate. I don't have any of the things that you need. Like, my mom has that, and she's not. When I left, she wouldn't give me any of those things because she was angry. So it took me like 4 years to prove I was a person after I left.
Jesus Christ.
It was a very long process. But outside of, I went to stay at my grandma's, but they kept bringing me back. So eventually my now ex and I ran away together and moved in together. We actually lived right down here off Ashley Phosphate, and in an apartment. And we were not going back to that life, the church, that culture. We were both done. And so in a sense, I felt there was hope that I was getting away from that it was going to be different. And that was kind of like, I was like, well, I'm going to be, free now. And it's going to be a different life. And at first, it seemed that like it was going to go that way. But the reality of being indoctrinated like that, you don't just walk away, in the mental like box that you've been in. It doesn't just open for everybody and you be normal or open to ideas and different ways of being. And I would say that we kind of branched out from what we knew our whole lives. We did, but still in my at the time husband's head, it was well, we weren't married yet, but my boyfriend, it was still, he was the total in control leader and I had no choices. And that never changed.
So he still held on to some of their beliefs,
the
values, core beliefs
yes.
or whatever. Even though you guys were out of the actual church itself, he still held on to that. So in a sense, you're free to a degree, but you're still, you're
still in the bubble in the sense, because I still couldn't go into the world and participate in, like, be around people that was like, this is not healthy. This level of control over you by another person is not normal or healthy. It's, abusive, but you don't, like, again, when I left home and, I thought my idea of love was someone not hitting me or screaming at me all day long.
Right.
I had no concept of what healthy or normal, I had no idea. So it felt great, the level of like waking up every day and not having somebody hit you or scream at you constantly. You're just like, oh, this is amazing. And you start to realize only later that you're still trapped, that you're still in this cage that you can't get out of. And that part has been a constant, been a constant theme of my life, trying to figure out how to get out of the box. But he did end up going back after his grandpa passed away. So
how long were you out?
So from the time I was 17 to 24. So it wasn't super long, but during that time I had all of my kids. I had my first at 17, second at 18, third at 21, and my last at 24. But I was at home, like I was in a bubble. I had no friends. I didn't have a phone, a car. Like I was just, at home with my kids. And we would walk to like the park and the library sometimes, but that was the extent of the life that I lived. But when his grandpa passed, he went back in like full, like completely sold out for it because he felt like that's what his grandpa would have wanted, and he got saved through the death of his grandpa. So he then was like, that day he was like, you know, things are about to change around here, and whether or not you're ready for it, it's happening. And at that time, I had a newborn, like I had a maybe 6-month-old at that time. And so I was already like, you know, drowning in life. Mm-hmm. And he was like, we're going back to service on Sunday morning. You're going to be up and have everybody ready to go to be at this, you know, first service. And I don't want to hear any, you know, there's going to be no questions about how or why you're going to dress this way. You know, it was just like a full and complete turn from like, oh, sorry. Like what I was, you know, right back into it. And it was just like that.
Not a complete 180.
And at first I was hopeful that maybe it would change. Like if it was a real, you know, experience that he had, like there would be a change. And I would, at the time, I still was, I guess, more in the mindset of I believed in a God. I believed in, I guess, higher power, like having some influence over your life. So I had hope that there was going to be a change in him that was real, because up until that point it had been like extreme. Either it was like he was mentally, emotionally abusive, or he was in extreme neglect of us. So it was like you were trying to get a person to participate in life that had no tools to do that, and it was a mess. Like he didn't understand parenting, like not that any of us did, but it was rough. And I was at the point when he was at that place where he was like, we're going to go back. I was at the point of suicide because of how bad it was at home, I guess, if that makes it. Like, isolation is not healthy in the amounts that I have had to do it over a lifetime.
Yeah.
But I did learn a lot through it. But it was at a point where not only was I isolated, but like I was never allowed to be myself, even in the isolation. Like in my own home, it was not free for me to be me. Mm-hmm. Like I always was supposed to be like cook like his mother, like clean like his mother, like do this like this person or that. Like I was never allowed to be myself. And then the way that I parented, I wasn't allowed to parent like that because he wanted them to be robots like we were. And I was not that person. I was not that parent. I was not going to repeat that cycle.
Yeah.
And that we fought a lot over that. He didn't think that I should read stories to them or sing to them at night because that made them weak and sissies. And it got to a point where they were, my oldest was about 7, and he said they would always ask every night, and we lived in a 2-bedroom house, and so at the time all 3 of my kids were in the same room, and they every night when they would go to bed, they would ask for stories and songs and things like that. And my oldest son came to ask for it, and that made my ex really mad. He was like, "You're too old for that. You're not going to grow up and be a wuss or a sissy." And he told him to go back in there, and that if he cried or came out of the room, that he would beat him. And then he told me that if I went to him, that he would beat them. If I went to them and like tried to do any of those things anymore, and he found out, he would beat all of them. And that, I think, was one of the major points of my life that kind of broke me in the way that was like, if I have to die trying to figure out a way out of this, then that's what's going to happen. But having no support system, like no family that you can just go live with,
makes it harder.
Yeah, you can't leave with babies, and they're going. The other side of it was when they're that young, your kids aren't developed enough to see a difference. And if I was to leave them and his family had taken them from me and I have no way to fight for them back, then I lose them.
And they're going to grow up just like you did.
Yeah. And that was my worst fear. My worst fear was ever having kids and ever getting married, because I didn't want my kids to go through what I went through. And I didn't want to go through what I saw all the women that I grew up watching go through. And I lived my worst nightmare, but then was like punished for it, because they were always, my ex especially, like, you never wanted them, like, you don't have any, like, you're supposed to want this is what you're supposed to, as a woman, want out of life, and there's something wrong with you if you don't, and like, this should be your desire, basically. And I think that part was also part of a like inner struggle for me for a long time, like understanding what my thoughts and feelings were about it, but nobody else ever reflecting that was not weird. And then having to basically kind of see your kids, start seeing them going through the stuff and that you were trying to protect them from, and knowing that you're in a position where you can't fully protect them from the reality around them. And that part was like trauma on top of trauma for me. So that at that point I became pretty suicidal, when it was like, I just like, like if I can't.
It's okay.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. As a mother, you want to be able to protect your kids, and you know what you come up in. You're trying to protect them from going down that same route. And I guarantee you, there's someone out there watching this right now that has been through or is going through what you're going through. And your situation is compounded because you've got kids, and like you said, you have nobody you can go to. So it's important to give hope to people that think there is no way out. How were you able to finally get out of that situation?
It's a very long time. Well, I had to wait for my kids to grow up, because if they were at home, they weren't allowed to go to school, because that would ruin their lives. So I had to homeschool. And I tried to always, and I went to the library religiously. The things that I learned were through the library, and my outside influences were library and eventually YouTube. Once I got, YouTube became a thing.
Yeah.
I had a phone, because I didn't for a very long time. It wasn't until, probably after, it was probably around 2015, 16, I had kind of more, I had a phone that had access for, internet and stuff like that. So I researched so much on, the reason that I did, and I did it at the library and online, was I was researching mental illnesses, because that was something that I was always accused of when I would say anything about situations that I didn't like or stuff that bothered me. My ex would always be like, you're just crazy like your family, you need to put medication. So I did a lot of research on it to see, am I crazy? Am I the problem? That was so it became kind of an obsession, I would say, but I learned so much through that about psychology mental disorders and psychopathy, all of those things. And, but those things were not allowed in the church, like those ideas. And I knew that, so I didn't talk about it. I didn't say anything. But I was watching, so his grandpa was gone, but the new pastor was trying to build a bigger church, have bigger influence. And so we moved from a small building to where they are now, which is a much bigger building. And we went very quickly from like 70, 80 people to 300 plus people. And my ex was like second, like he was kind of like, he was second in command-ish, whatever you want to call it. He didn't have assistant pastor, so it wasn't that, but he was like his right-hand guy. They were all preachers, but they weren't allowed to be like in power. Like he was one and only, and there was like a few men that he would have, which were his yes men, and the things that were happening were consistently, like routinely, a lot of men were being protected that shouldn't be in the church once again. And seeing that again, like as an adult, I was not okay with that, like especially with having my kids there and other people's kids there. They weren't being warned about the predators that were sitting in services, and there was 2 convicted rapists that were in the service, and another that admitted to, he wasn't convicted or even charged, and he's not, to my knowledge, he's not even been charged, or it's not been talked about. But he went to the pastor and said that he had raped his daughter, or he didn't say like he had had sex with his daughter because he was addicted to porn and he couldn't help himself. And instead of reporting him to the police, the pastor basically said he was just a man. It's like, we've got to deal, just basically cover up the situation. And I would see that man come and he would bring his daughter. He would bring, and she had a baby with, and a boyfriend. And, I believe she was, at the time it happened, like 16. I don't even know. She was young. And they would shake his hand and call him brother. And I just, like, my brain couldn't wrap around that. And plus the way that they treated, there was elites in the church, and then there was, it depends on where you are as to your ranking. And they treated people like trash that they had no reason to. And they would treat people like him, like they would treat men who had no business walking around free in society like they were valuable members of society, and they would treat other people like they were just trash, like women especially, and children, a lot of the children if you weren't part of certain families. So it was kind of then that I was like, I'm not going to be part of this anymore. I will not be here. So I had several fights with my ex about what was going on, leaving. I had told him I wasn't happy in marriage and I wasn't in love with him. I didn't like how this was going. I couldn't stay. And basically he was like, you're just crazy. And I was like, okay. So I went and made an appointment with a psychologist, and I was like, if I'm crazy, then I'm going to go get help if that's what the problem is. And I went and made an appointment, and I talked to her, and she said at the end of it, she said, well, I was like, I need to know. Like, I need to know if I'm insane, because that's what's been told to me my entire life, that I'm just too emotional. I'm not spiritual enough. So that was another thing. Like, I went to the pastor's wife for help, and other ladies, and everything was swept under the rug, because the pastor's wife literally told me, well, the most important thing is that he's a man of God. Like, the things that I would say about my ex, like, he would take care of everybody in the church and everyone thought he was the best person ever. But at home, we had sewer leaking all in the backyard, and he wouldn't take care of anything or fix anything for us at home. He wasn't there for the kids. He would actively neglect us in all of the ways that he should have been there for us and be there for everyone else in those ways. And then act like I was crazy if I asked for anything or needed anything from him. And I went to her and she was like, well, the most important thing is basically that you stay spiritual and prayed up, because men are just weak, basically, and they can't help it. And you're going to have to be his like support system. Like, you need to stay in touch with God and hold the family together, because basically the most dishonorable thing that can happen to you in that society, like that culture, is that you get divorced and that you break up the family because you were too weak to pray it away. Like, you were too weak to pray away.
Well, it keeps them from continuing their cycle too. Yeah.
And that the image, that was another huge part for when we, especially once we moved to the new building, the image became such a huge factor that we had to sign a contract to be in choir, that we wouldn't post certain things on social media, that our social media would be monitored, and we couldn't post this or that. We had to wear certain clothing or we would not be allowed to get in choir inside the church and outside. And that means mid-calf, loose flowing, not drawing attention to yourself, not making a man lust type garments.
On a prison camp.
And so the other thing was, like, as my ex was considered to be more prominent in there, like, as his wife, I wasn't to wear pants around town. So I'd be giving other women the idea that that would be okay, and also causing men to fall in lust because I was wearing things that I shouldn't be wearing, which would have been pants or something like that. And that I needed to be at all of the functions. That means every time there's a function happening that I should be there and not skip out, any of those things. And at that point, we were at the church more nights. I think we had one night off at that point because there was Bible college going on. We had Wednesday services Sunday, and there was women classes on Thursdays. It was just nonstop. And I had got to a point where I could not take any more of the pressure of a lifetime of being something I'm not. And I didn't want it. It's not who I am. It's not what I believe. And I don't believe that anyone has the right to treat somebody else terribly because you think you know God, and that you don't have a license to abuse another person in any way because you think that you're close to God.
Right.
But that was like kind of the breaking point. So I went to the psychologist, and she basically was like, you're not crazy. Basically, you're just in an environment where you're surrounded by people who you don't have support, and there's some dangerous ideas, and maybe you should look into, like, basically some other resources to help you kind of. And of course, I was going to her at the time, and I took my ex. He agreed to go, and we had one session. It was about relationship stuff, and he went back and told the pastor about it, and the pastor was very upset. It's like, you can't, especially not a woman telling you. And so at that point, I was, especially after speaking to the pastor's wife and basically getting told that I just wasn't spiritual enough. If I wore my skirts right and I, prayed enough, then my life would be better and everything would be fine. God would be blessing me instead of, I wouldn't be struggling. So I texted her, I think maybe a week or so later, and told her I wasn't going to show up to be, because I was doing so much there. I did nursery, which was taking care of the kids. I did Sunday school. There was so many things that we were a part of, like, doing constantly. And I told her I wasn't coming back, and I told her the reasons. She never one time asked to meet or was like, I'm so sorry, can we have, can we don't want this to be the way that it is. Like, can we have a conversation and like try to figure out what's going wrong here? She just accepted and was like, yeah, I wish you well. Basically, I was the problem child there, so I didn't really expect any different than that. But immediately after that, the floodgates basically opened because my ex was like, well, I'm going to go back. He wasn't going to stop going. He was going to continue to go. And he went to another service and they were preaching on basically allowing the devil into your life and mind, basically allowing outside influences to in your mental illnesses, because also in there, mental illness isn't real and depression isn't real. Those are all the devil, and you just aren't spiritual enough to pray it away. You're just not strong enough of a person spiritually to do better. So basically they were saying that I was like mentally ill and that was the problem. And I was just not spiritual enough. So he tried to have a conversation with the pastor and it did not go well. He basically was telling him that I was destroying everything, and creating a shame for the church and ruining lives. And so my ex decided to leave, and everyone that we ever had known since childhood or birth for him was not allowed to talk to us. His mother ended up leaving, but his sister stayed. My brother stayed. My brother's still a part of it.
Jeez.
Yeah. But that's how strong it is that the people you are related to, that you've grown up with, will turn their back on you because one man says they're bad, they're evil. One man, all he has to do is say, and his word is more valuable than the law, than anyone else's on earth. So they all immediately they shut us off. And then from that point, they're weaponized against you.
Yeah.
So he called all of the churches, and that's hundreds on the east coast, not just in South Carolina, because they were affiliated with from Maryland down to Florida with churches, and in the Midwest too. There's so many. I mean, the Duggars are they're IFB.
Mm-hmm.
They're an offshoot of, they're one of the flavors of this type of culture. So, the people who were in those churches were warned not to let us show up there because we were at odds with our pastor. And if you're at odds with your pastor for any reason, you are not allowed or welcome at any other church. So you're not allowed to go there, and they're to basically not listen to anything you have to say or speak to you, or their members, because then you could influence their members to defect. You're
the villain. They don't want you basically bringing sense to
we
them.
We don't want the devil being brought to us.
Yeah.
So then at that point, I had told my ex, like, these are the requirements for us to stay together. And that is, we move, the kids are going to school, you're in therapy, and you have 2 years, and I'm not going to bring it up again. But if these things don't happen, it's over. Because I'm not doing this for the rest of my life. And I'm not staying with somebody who's in this mentality for the rest of my life. And I'm not fighting with you every day over all the little things that need to change. And he agreed to that. The kids went to school, but they went to a Christian school in Lexington or West Columbia. And unfortunately, some of our members had kids there. And the bullying, so the pastor's children and some other people from our church, adult children, mind you, were trying to come pick up my kids who were underage and take them for coffee to help them through this hard time. Like trying to basically turn them against us and try to keep them in the culture. So that was happening. And then when they realized that they weren't going to be able to do that, like influence the kids that way, they started having their kids bully them at school. And then once word, I guess, got out of that, then of course that Christian school, it was a really toxic situation. We ended up having to move to where we are now and go to a whole different school completely for them. But the pastor, this is not the only time that people have left before. His sister also had left before, and he did the same thing to them. I mean, anyone who's ever left, he villainizes and turns everyone against them. So
even own family.
Yep.
Do you have a relationship at all with your brother?
No.
So this cult, this church cult is so powerful that it drives wedges between siblings.
Oh, for sure. For sure. If you lose something, like when we were in it, people would leave and you had to cut them. You weren't supposed to be seen with them. You weren't supposed to speak to them. And that's just a normal, accepted, like shunning is a real thing that they approve of and condone. But he also keeps a list of all the people who've left or wronged him in any way and their children, and he tries to get at least one of their children back.
Gee, that's sinister within itself. It's wow. And you've made mention that your ex, and you laid out the conditions to the term your then husband. I'm assuming he did not live up to those.
Not quite, no.
Okay.
It did not work out. We had reached we did move and, got away, like, to where we're now. But it was like there were so many things. I was in therapy at the time. I was seeing a therapist, but he wouldn't go. He said he didn't have time. And he wouldn't put in any effort into that. And then so he switched from our entire life. I was not allowed to work. I wasn't allowed to participate in anything related to that side of things. I could work for him for free, basically, to help him build his business and do the pilot card driving, because he does mobile home moving. But I wasn't allowed to have a job of my own and build any independence. But when we left, also another part of this is, and I didn't talk about that, was I had never been allowed to have access to finances, or there was no. So we had a 3-day fight in 2013 over the fact that I had to forge his name on checks to get gas or groceries. Now, these were like basic necessities, but they knew me at the bank as that person.
Yeah.
They knew what was happening, to the point that the woman said to me, she's like, honey, she's like, don't come back here again with one of these. She said, you go home and you make him put you on this account. She said, this is ridiculous. Because I almost ran out of gas one day on the way to a family member's funeral. I did not have enough gas to get there, and I called him and I was like, I don't have gas, and the lady won't take the forged thing, and he thought it was funny and he just laughed about it. And then we had that fight where he said that I was ruining our relationship and our marriage. If he said this will end our relationship if you get on the bank account, because that ruins relationships. And he's like, the pastor will even agree with me that this is how relationships get ruined, because you're going to go out there spending all this money. And the craziest thing to me was like, I never got to spend money. He was always accusing me of that, but yeah.
It might end it when you find out what he's spending money on.
Well, I never had access to see any of those things, so I don't know what he did. But he did end up in a lot of debt, which he signed my name to, so now I owe his tax debt because he put us down as jointly filed, and so now his debt is mine even after. So that's really special. I love that for me. And on this side of it, so when we moved out there, he wanted me to work a job and then pay half the bills all of a sudden, like, or pay for whatever I needed so that he didn't have to carry all the expense, he said. So, but he didn't want me to get a job that wasn't working with him. But then I would work for him and I would get paid, but then he would want me to use that money for any of the stuff that I had to buy for me or the kids.
Christ almighty.
And that was, like, I was just thinking, like, I had to still do all the housework, all the cooking, all the cleaning, all the stuff with the kids, like all the sports, all the picking up and dropping off, all the doctor. And I had to go to work at the same hours he was working. And he would come home and say, well, I'm too tired to go to the kids' game, or I'm too tired to do X, Y, and Z. But I still had to do all of those things and work those hours. And then he would get annoyed if I didn't work every single day that he worked. And I was like, you either have to do half of what I'm doing if you want me to do the work part too, or like, I can't work every single day that you're working, or why are we even doing this? You know, like, and at the same time realizing, like, my daughters were starting to date and they were picking horrible, horrible people because it's all they've seen. Mm-hmm. And realizing that while I'm telling them, you shouldn't let him treat you like that. You deserve better. You don't let somebody do things like that or say things. And then them looking at me like, yeah, what are you saying to me? What are you talking? You know, like, just so baffled. And then I can remember looking at my daughter's face when it hit me. They're only doing what they've seen. Mm-hmm. And I'm the problem, because if they don't see something different, then they'll never be different. Yeah. And that was kind of like, I made an appointment because I told him basically I'm out and done. And he was like, well, let's go to therapy then. And we did it for a minute, and I was just, through therapy, just realized there is nothing here for me. Yeah. There's nothing to be saved. And that just, that's been the last year and a half.
So you're just now really getting 100% clear of all this, husband included. Yes. Essentially, you're just now like experiencing life where, like you said, you could be yourself. You can go to your own job, do your own thing, mm-hmm. social media, go to functions, etc. That's wild, man. Yeah. And this is all right here in the local area. And this was in where, Orangeburg?
No, Lexington.
Lexington, okay. Mm-hmm. Wow. I guess we'll end it by this question. I said this earlier. There's probably some people out there, I'm sure, that are going through this. What's a message you can give to someone that's involved in this that wants to get out? And we'll end it on
that. Well, I would definitely recommend it for sure. Highly. 10 out of 10. Leave however you can, and as quickly as possible. I would say I waited because I was afraid for so long. I waited trying to have everything the way it needed to be, and it never was. And I never got to a point where I was like, oh, it's safe. I just one day had to just go, and I didn't know how. When I left the cold, I didn't know how it was going to go. But there was no other option, I felt like, at that point. And everything is so much better and easier. Like, the worst day out here doesn't compare to one of the better days there. It really doesn't. And as hard as it is to lose and that, I will say, I think that probably my whole life experience conditioned me for losing everyone. I left my whole family at 16, and then I left a whole culture. And I know based on how I've responded versus how my kids have responded that I'm probably more conditioned to walk away from people than most people and not go back, because if I logically can look at it and say that's not good for us, the loss to me isn't a loss. And there's still, while there can be the most painful thing emotionally, I will not let that stop me. So I think that part is probably the thing I would say for someone that wants to leave. That will be the hardest part, and that will be why most people don't leave and why they tend to go back, is when every part of your support system is there and you are so alone, and not just alone. You are then persecuted. Like you are being attacked by everyone that said they loved you. And you have to deal with that for you don't know how long. And maybe always, because they're never not going to do that. They're never not going. There will be services about me until the day I'm dead or they're dead, you know. And there will be an idea that I'm evil and my kids are evil, and you know, like from people who said they loved you, from the people who watched you grow up from the time you were a baby, you know, that were like family to you, and some are family, who will look at you like you are a curse and stay away from you because it might rub off on them. Your sinfulness might become theirs if they get too close to you. So mentally, you have to be strong. You have to be willing to walk away from everything you know, and then not know that you will have support or anyone there for you, and be okay with that for however long it takes for you to rebuild your whole life. And it will take time. You're not going to just walk out of that to open arms of something better right away. You're going to have to rebuild from scratch. And I think that's the hardest part. And I think that's probably the reason that most people will never, I mean, people don't even leave situations they should, like toxic relationships.
Yeah.
When there's no, you know, and it's like the judgment of like having to leave a relationship is bad, let alone when it's every single person pretty much you know and know for a lifetime. So,
I mean, I appreciate you coming on the show and telling this story, because I think it's some of those things that people have always heard about, but they don't really know the details of it, and to the dramatic effects that it has on you. And unfortunately, you know, it really took all the way into your kids looking at you when you're telling them what they need to accept, right and wrong, and they look at you and it's like, well, you're accepting it. And that's kind of the hammer that, you know, needed to come down for you to just be done with all this. And, you know, I know you're in the process of rebuilding, and, you know, I wish you the best on that. You're very brave, and I do think this will probably be an inspiration to somebody going through a very similar situation. And, you know, I want to thank you very much for coming on and telling your story.
Thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate you reaching out and
You're
caring
welcome.
enough to
Absolutely.
ask.
Well, absolutely. Well, I mean, I feel like it's my duty to put, you know, stories out there of people that's overcome things. And, you know, you went through a lot and you've overcome them. You're working to do better. And that's essentially what we like to highlight on the show. So thank you very much for coming on. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that'll do it for this episode of Crime and Entertainment. We'll put links to the show and all the other audio platforms in the show notes. Thank you again, Jessica, for coming on the show.
Appreciate it.